Hello there, so misleading title alert. This video isn't a list of tips and tricks explaining how to use the editor. This is about the editor tips, Osu's long-forsaken mapping tutorials. You probably forgot these even existed. Editor tips are the short messages that appear every time you open the edit window, saying stuff like, test your beatmap often to identify potential problems and improvements, or make sure sliders don't overlap each other, and especially not themselves. By the time anyone becomes a decent mapper, they've seen each of these 34 different messages hundreds of times. We all ignore them. We all forget they exist. Which is perfectly understandable. They're meant for new mappers to read, and I mean new mappers. The ones who literally just opened the editor for the first time and are prompted with a short message saying to be nice with spinners. While I haven't truly looked at them in years, I do think these messages can be beneficial. When I was a fresh out of the womb mapper, I would actually read each of these tips to learn some bare-bone basics of mapping. I wasn't interested in searching for real tutorials or detailed information on how to map, but a quick sentence or two that I'd be seeing anyway when opening the editor was fine by me. These editor tips are a great tool for providing entry-level mapping info in easily digestible chunks for mappers with literally zero experience. And that's why it's a shame the editor tips are so outdated. That's to be expected, honestly, given how most of the editors are in a similar situation, but I didn't know exactly how outdated editor tips were until a few days ago. I just ate a cake. In what appears to be an older version of the Osu client, this was an editor tip that I hadn't seen before. It got me wondering, how different were editor tips in the past compared to now? Answering that took a bit of investigation. First off, I familiarized myself with the tips available in the modern editor and formed a general idea of how behind the times they were. Some ideas expressed in these tips are completely out of line with how mapping works today, such as the recommended break every 40 seconds to 1 minute of gameplay that nobody follows anymore, or the concept that low difficulties are adapted directly from higher difficulties with objects removed and more lenient difficulty settings. The last time I saw someone even attempt that was 4 years ago. There's also this message about the in-game help menu, which I recall being nice when I first joined the game, but in the current editor it actually doesn't do anything. The keyboard shortcut and drop-down button are both broken. And along with those, there's a lot of weird terminology used that's clearly a remnant of older times on Osu. Objects, or circles I think, are called beats, and slider anchors are called waypoints, both terms I haven't heard used in all the time since I've started playing Osu. So it's pretty weird that notions and words this irrelevant are being promoted front and center to every new mapper out there. Although it does make sense when starting from the beginning. In 2007, there was only one editor tip, and it actually worked. This in-game help is arguably one of the best teaching devices available for brand new mappers because it shows the functionality of essential tools. Maybe it doesn't cover as much info as the various different editor messages, but this one tip is really more valuable than any of the others. Those others were introduced sometime within the next year, and disappointingly, a lot of its content was the same as that of the modern editor. Yeah, there's a few variations like the cute little cake thing, but there's still an unfortunate amount of overlap for how old it is. Comparing each one, this many editor tips were removed sometime within the last 10 years, this many were rewritten slightly, and this many are the exact same. Pretty bad if you ask me, considering 2008 mapping and 2018 mapping barely even resemble each other. Like, just skimming through a few average 10-year-old maps and a few average maps today makes that really obvious. Moving forward, there's not much to analyze. Gradually, some messages got changed or removed as the years progressed, though Pepe's grudge over a stolen cake held strong for quite a while. 2013's editor naturally has tips really close to the modern one. Comparing each message again, this many were removed over the next 5 years, this many were rewritten, and this many were kept the same. Good change right here though, I approve. Given how similar 2013 and 2018 are, it's not really worth looking at the years in between. But anyway, current editor tips are old, and using that information as the most prominent educational content available to new mappers sucks. Yeah, it sucks. How could this be improved? Should be obvious, thinking of some new tips to shove in the face of new mappers. So let's break down the existing tips first by putting them into 3 broad categories: literal editor tips, mapping theory, and general information. That first category covers a majority of current messages. Editor tools like distance snap and how to perform basic tasks like drawing sliders are explained, which for the most part do apply up through today and are useful for new mappers. A few tips like what the V key does or the J and K nudge options aren't used nearly as much as tools like rotate and scale though, so it would probably be better to give the more used ones priority in editor tips. The next category is the second largest, and also the most problematic. Mapping theory, or the ideas behind map design, aren't at all the same as they were back when these tips were written. These include ones like the break times and spread construction I mentioned earlier. Personally, I think there's lots of better content to replace these with, the conventional mapping techniques that apply in most situations now. That would be real basic stuff, like make strong sounds clickable and jumps can make important parts of the music stand out, which aren't mapping law, but are okay guidelines to think about early on. The smallest category contains useful information, though it could use some updates. Forum posts are no longer the main place for modding, as implied by this message, and there's a pinned thread specifically for timing help unmentioned in the where to find timing help message. There's also more general information that new mappers could really use, like where to find mods and what the ranking criteria is. So overall, these three categories of editor tips provide good introductory mapper coverage, but there's clearly room for improvement in each one, and it's a shame nobody's done anything about it. But wait, these messages are out of date, and no experienced mappers pay attention to them. Is it just that since these tips became outdated, nobody invested in mapping has actually tried to improve these tips before? Initially, this video was just going to be me complaining about another aspect of how the editor is outdated, but these tips are the kind of thing that could reasonably be changed before Lazer is ready for use. I asked around and learned that adjusting these is possible, so I got to work on updating them based on the basic mapping knowledge I think new mappers in 2018 would find relevant. First, I sorted through the existing messages to see what was still valuable, what needed wording changes, and what should be outright removed. Next, I mapped something simple while keeping track of what editor tools and basic mapping concepts I take for granted and use nonstop, then wrote them down in shorthand ways. Once everything was planed out, I reworded all the still applicable old messages, then fully worded tips from my list of important beginner mapper information. And that leads us to now. It's unlikely you've noticed since, again, nobody pays attention to editor tips, but they've been revamped from their previous 2008 irrelevancy. Providing a list of new, proper messages was all it took, which any mapper could reasonably do because the content here is as basic as it gets. So yeah, if you want to read what you should already know, open the editor. It's right there. What about on Lazer though? Will Lazer continue the legacy of these cute editor tips? I'm not sure it's planned, but the issue of easing players into mapping in the editor may be solved in another way. The editor, like any creative program, has a bunch of tools and options available to let its users design things with as much freedom and as many opportunities as possible. For newcomers though, all these options are overwhelming, especially when most aren't necessary. Like, I could make an alright map with these 4 tools alone, and with just a few more, I'd be fully comfortable. According to some talks at Anime Expo last year, the editor will be easier to get into than ever through limitations. An editor with only the most essential tools will be available, as well as a more advanced one that contains all the obscure tools we're used to seeing today and probably much more. Perhaps plans have changed since that time half a year ago, though I still think it would be a great way to make mapping more friendly going forward. Friendly in the same vein as easily learnable editor tips, just multitudes more effective. We'll have to see it in action to truly find out, but I've got hopes. And I also hope the updated editor tips can be helpful for mappers new to the game in current times as well, since we've got no definitive date when Lazer will be ready for mapping. But anyway, that's about it. Short one this time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.